Hi, I'm Nick Inglis. Welcome to Structuring Serendipitous Collaboration, my session for the Collab365 virtual conference. I'm incredibly honored to be asked again by the Collab365 team to take part in another of their amazing virtual conferences. And a huge thank you to the sponsors of this event, whose support makes events like this possible. I'm Nick Inglis. I'm the CEO of Optismo and IGKit. I have a few credentials that I'm pretty proud of here. I'm the co-creator of the Information Governance Conference, an annual conference which takes place in Hartford, Connecticut in the U.S. Just took place about a week and a half ago. The creator of the Information Governance Model, the author of the AIM SharePoint Governance Toolkit, and most importantly and proudly, I'm Connor's dad. You can reach me at my email down there in the orange box, or say hello to me on any form of social media. I'm always open to questions. To give you an idea of what my teams do, at Optismo, we're known as the leading consulting firm for information governance, and we've established information governance practices at companies worldwide, many that you're likely to know. We also help other vendors establish their marketing through content services assessment and inbound marketing systems establishment and outsourcing. We're pretty good at these things. IGKit is a turnkey information governance solution that cleans up repositories like SharePoint, handles migration, cleans up junk content, deduplicates, classifies, enhances metadata, and enables legally defensible disposition and deletion strategies. All right, enough of that. You want to collaborate. I want to collaborate. Everyone wants to collaborate. The problem is that no one seems to have any idea how to enable collaboration, let alone the kind of collaboration that we're going to be talking about today, serendipitous collaboration or accidental collaboration. Even many of those that seem to have a decent grasp on what collaboration actually is and what serendipitous collaboration is, don't want to do all of the work that it actually takes to enable collaboration. Most companies are thinking, quick fix. Throw some technology at it and everyone goes home happy. We can just throw some yammer into the organization and everybody can collaborate. Well, it simply doesn't work that way, at least not effectively. So what is the problem? One problem is that the tools that we have today really suck at making collaboration happen between different groups of people. We have team collaboration, but we struggle with collaboration between people in different divisions of a company, or people with the same types of roles that work in different areas or different teams. On the other hand, executive teams don't really care about collaboration until they hear about some of the actual benefits that collaboration can have on a company. One group that has done some excellent studies on collaboration is AIM, a group where I used to be a director, and we'll take a look at one of their older studies in this presentation. But let's start by understanding how we structure SharePoint. Most organizations structure SharePoint along the lines of their org chart. Org charts allow us to divide up our companies in an easy-to-understand way, and we're comfortable and familiar with org chart demarcations within our companies. But there are some problems with the org chart structure for SharePoint that we need to acknowledge. One is that it makes job mobility incredibly difficult. Let's say that you're in a finance role in one division, and you move to a similar role, but in a different division. Where's all your old content? Well, it's all in the division that you just left. Should that employee just start over from scratch with all new content in their new role? No, it's likely that some of the content could be very easily repurposable in their new role. But depending upon the permissioning strategies of the company, that content is now inaccessible to them. You also have issues where some of the same tasks are being completed in many different departments. And they're being completed in inconsistent ways because of those artificial demarcations of the org chart, and thus the artificial demarcations of our SharePoint implementations. Similar content doesn't get grouped together when the creating roles are in different teams or divisions, and we end up with a lot of content that's lacking enterprise-wide context. We can't understand the big picture, and we're asking for more business intelligence, because the small pictures are spread so thinly and so diversely across the organization. This is, however, the way that nearly every SharePoint implementation I've ever come across is structured. Has anyone ever considered that, hey, maybe there's a better way? Okay, let's leave that thought for a moment because we're going to come back to it. Let's discuss now how collaboration can happen within an organization. We can have collaboration happening within departments. That's pretty typical and it's pretty easy. We can also have collaboration happening across departments. Now, that tends to be a bit harder. From the team perspective, we put together a team from various places within the organization and we collaborate within a team. We can throw a team site at that and collaboration happens, right? Yeah, that's relatively easy. But what about when we want to work across teams? It tends to be a lot harder. We could also have collaboration happen within a discipline in an organization. And this is one of the most effective forms of collaboration that exists, but it's also one of the hardest for companies to enable. Let's get all of the project managers from across the company in their varied divisions and their varied teams to all collaborate to improve how we're all working. That's hard. It's incredibly hard. So while we're working on this, we need to think about how we enable collaboration within departments and how we enable collaboration across departments, within teams, and enabling collaboration across teams. And then within disciplines. It's developing these strategies and then enacting them that takes work. And it's not simply throwing technology at the problem. So how do we enable departmental or divisional collaboration? Well, SharePoint does this by default. If you're structuring your SharePoint implementation by the org chart, you've got this. Going cross-departmental, however, we'll talk through a strategy in a moment. How about teams? We have to establish some logical team structures. It's also pretty easy to do this with team sites and Yammer groups. Microsoft gives us a lot of tools for team collaboration. We just need to pay attention to the permissions and give appropriate access for sharing knowledge. All right, third grouping here. How do we enable discipline-based collaboration or role-based collaboration? It's this idea of content subjects, which we will expand upon through an information architecture. Now let's try to understand this through the example of these two teams. These two teams are working on two different projects that are somewhat related, and they're composed of basically identical roles. We've got some project managers, some finance folks, some business analysts, and IT. Well, if all we have are the org chart demarcations within our SharePoint environment, we have some issues. These teams are composed of individuals who are all over this organization, even with different reporting paths. Well, that's why Microsoft has given us team sites and Yammer groups, right? All right, from a team site perspective, the individual teams are able to collaborate. But what if we want the project managers to learn from each other's projects, learn what worked and learn what didn't, and then gain efficiencies through learning about one another's successes and failures? Well, we have no real mechanism for that until we start talking about discipline-based collaboration. And Microsoft has yet to really address this in any meaningful way. So we need to figure out a way to address it. Yes, we have profiles, and we could, in theory, have our project managers speaking with one another by finding each other through their profiles, but let's be serious. That doesn't actually happen. So since we have no mechanism for these discipline or role-based collaboration models, we need to structure serendipitous collaboration. And yes, I just said the title of the presentation. While we can understand that there is an issue, there isn't a great solution out there yet. There's been a lot of talk about communities of practice and knowledge management initiatives as a starting point for solving the issue of discipline-based collaboration, but it all has to start with improving search and serendipity through improving the information architecture of your SharePoint implementation itself. And the fact of the matter is that culture does matter in improving serendipitous collaboration. There was an AIM study from quite some time ago that still resonates today, as most organizations still struggle with this issue. Survey respondents that said that they were knowledge management inclined had far greater adoption rates of the underlying tools for improving collaboration. And it certainly couldn't hurt to explain to your organization, whatever its culture, the rationale behind the work in improving the information architecture. You might even gain support and assistance from unexpected areas. Now, let's discuss information architecture and how to improve our information architecture in SharePoint. And let's begin by defining what information architecture is. And I think the best definition of information architecture comes from Earl Moreau in his 2003 book, Information Architecture, an Emerging 21st Century Profession. In his book, he defines information architecture as a professional practice and field of studies focusing on solving the basic problems of accessing and using the vast amounts of information available today. And that was in 2003. We've only compounded this problem by the time we've gotten to today. What we're going to focus on is how to build an information architecture in SharePoint and how to sustain it over the long term. We'll divide this into 3 steps: plan, deploy, and sustain. Planning an information architecture in SharePoint has to begin with the goals of information architecture. And we'll define these goals here, that we want to support our users' ability to find content. We'll refer to that as findability. We want information architecture to be applied consistently. Since we're using SharePoint for this task, we need to structure our information architecture, leveraging the functionality that SharePoint provides. And lastly, we need to build a SharePoint information architecture that is sustainable for the long-term functioning of our organization. For information architecture, I think it's helpful to think about certain SharePoint elements as containers. So containers are our structural elements that contain content or contain other containers of content. These containers are structured hierarchically. Since they are hierarchical, they allow us to establish our policies once and then push them through the hierarchical structures to affect underlying content. We have 2 sets of containers that include our site collections, which contain sites, which contain libraries, which contains content, or contains a folder which contains content. And we also have our content types, which apply metadata, which is then applied to content. Let's discuss how our content types function as a type of container. So content types, they're selected when we upload a piece of content into SharePoint. We have a choice of content types based on what content types are available for the library into which we're uploading. The content types define the metadata fields or metadata schema that is to be associated with the piece of content. Content types are structured hierarchically, and content types can apply policy. Now, as we're designing our SharePoint information architecture, I find that it's best to think about the physical containers first, our site collections, sites, and libraries. And then we add to that our taxonomic elements of content types and metadata. Combining these 5 elements, we're able to structure an information architecture that supports our underlying processes to align our information architecture with business processes through the use of the content organizer, tool that automatically routes content from one location to another based on rules, workflow, which provide us with defined processes in SharePoint, record centers and in-place records management, providing processes for records management in SharePoint, multi-stage retention, ensuring that we're consistently applying information management policies and records management policies around the keeping of content, and automated disposition, ensuring that we're consistently applying information management policies and records management policies around the removal of content. It also ensures that we're properly classifying content for accurate and appropriate use of e-discovery tools and litigation holds surrounding our compliance processes. Now let's wrap our heads around this with an example. We'll leverage our 5 elements of information architecture structure, our 3 physical containers and our 2 taxonomic elements. And in this example, we have a piece of content that's uploaded to the marketing assets library of the marketing site of the site collection for ABC division. The content type that is applied to this piece of content is contract. And because of that content type selection, the user was provided the metadata fields of vendor, contract size, and signer. From this information gathered from our physical containers and our taxonomic elements, we know a lot of information about this particular piece of content. And we can apply many of our business processes supporting records management, maybe the use of the content organizer, some workflow, and our multi-stage retention and disposition rules. We can apply it all automatically. Now, to plan our SharePoint information architecture, we need to plan our site collections and site hierarchy. We need to plan our content types, and we need to plan our metadata. When planning our site collections and sites, we should be mindful that our site collections and site plans should support navigation and the browsing habits of our users and should be logical to our users. We need to plan out where new sites will be created when they're requested by our user population through a site provisioning process. And here's a high-level visualized plan of site collections and sites. Now, in this simple plan, we have 2 separate site collections A and B. And we have sites A, B, C, and D, with several child sites included as well. We've also mapped out where new sites can be created through a provisioning process, which will allow for our hierarchical policies to be pushed downward through this waterfall of sites. When planning our content types, it is important to align the content types with how they'll be utilized in terms of policy and process within our SharePoint implementation. Now, first and foremost, our content type should be used to categorize content. That is the primary goal. Our content types can also be used to apply various workflow. They can be used to apply retention rules and disposition rules, and they can also be used to leverage the content organizer. Now, as you can probably tell by this point, I'm a visual and conceptual learner, so I'm going to push that on you guys as well. So let's take a look at this visualized plan for content types. Now, in this plan, we have 3 high-level content types of simply A, B, and C. Now, those content types are utilized as placeholders, and we can apply high-level policies to those content types. Usually, we apply things like retention policies at this level. We then have various other content types structured below. We've also included in this plan areas in which new content types can extend existing content types, and this is useful for a specific line of business requirements that, at the enterprise level, we simply may not be aware of. Now, our user population can extend our enterprise level content types. What they'll do is they'll take with them all the hierarchical policies that we applied at the highest levels possible, and then they'll add additional fields of metadata. Now please note, they can't themselves create new fields of metadata, but they can only apply fields that have already been created by us or exist already at the enterprise level. What this does is it ensures consistency with all of our enterprise policies and procedures, but it also gives some flexibility to our user population or our employees to structure SharePoint in a way that meets their specific needs. Okay, now let's take this high-level visualized plan and make it a little bit more real. Let's place it in a real-world setting here. So now we can see that we have specific content types for manufacturing, for marketing, and for HR. Under manufacturing, we have specifications and operations manuals. Under marketing, we have collateral, including white papers and brochures. And under HR, we have W-2s and accounting reports. And we've also mapped out, as we said before, the areas where we allow content type extension. Now, to continue this example, let's focus only on manufacturing. Our manufacturing line of business in this theoretical wants to have specifications for facilities separate from specifications for products. And that's something that at the enterprise level we didn't plan for. We didn't expect this. But there's no worries here, because we did plan for content type extension so that we can actually do this. So at the site admin, at that level, we can extend the content type of specification to add two new content types. One of facility specifications and product specifications. Now, facility specs and product specs will all have all of the metadata and information management policies of both manufacturing as the highest level content type in the hierarchy, and the metadata and information management policies of specifications. The site admin could even add additional fields of metadata if they already existed in the system. So perhaps they add facility identifier or facility ID to the facility specification and a product name to product specifications. And let's continue this example. Let's build out this piece of the information architecture. So we would set as many properties as possible at our highest level content type. And in this example, this is manufacturing. So for our manufacturing content type, we've associated the metadata of name and created by. We've also established on manufacturing our retention rules and our disposition rules. Since we're utilizing manufacturing only as a placeholder and not somewhere that we really want our users to be adding new content, we've set the content type to not accept new content. We then have created specifications, a content type below manufacturing, so it's its child. And this content type would receive as a child content type all of the properties associated with the manufacturing content type, including all of our metadata fields, in this case, name and created by, all of the retention rules, and also all of the disposition rules. It gets all of that. In addition, we've added some additional properties, including the metadata field of specification number. And we have opened this content type up to allow for the upload of content. In our example, we've also prepared for content type extension of the content type specifications. So any new content types that extend specifications would receive all of the properties associated with the content types of manufacturing as the highest level and specifications because of the hierarchical nature of content types. Any extended content types could also add additional metadata fields if they're already in the system. But new metadata fields can't be created for the purpose of adding them to the extended content type. Alright, I think we can put content types away for now, and we'll bring them back up in a bit. Now let's move on to talking about the related planning, very related planning, that we need to do for planning our metadata. Now, why should we plan our metadata? Much like why we plan our content types, we plan our metadata for the purposes of identifying content and improving findability for our users. When we do that, we can improve serendipity. We can also leverage our metadata, often in conjunction with our content types, to do all sorts of things. Apply workflow, apply multi-stage retention rules, apply our content and records disposition rules, and leverage the content organizer based off of metadata. With regards to planning our metadata, Microsoft has given us some key points to consider. Firstly, identify common information types and their required properties. Determine which data elements should be immutable and which can be left to the user's discretion. And this is going to allow us to determine which fields we should apply specific term sets to. We'll discuss that in a bit. Identify by lining up where we are deploying metadata, the syndication requirements, and manage metadata service application needs. What this will do is allow us to determine how and where we are deploying which metadata fields within our site collection and site plan. Likewise, we'll also define our term store roles and memberships to determine where we're deploying which term sets within our site collection and site plan. We'll specify any language requirements if we happen to be running a multilingual SharePoint implementation. Specifically, we will also begin to form a hierarchy of our terms, and then we'll group them logically. Finally, we'll do all of the work in actually creating our term sets and our related terms. When companies aren't Optismo clients yet, they often ask, what does it look like when we're creating our plan for metadata? Now, it generally looks like a giant Excel spreadsheet. And in this spreadsheet, we're going to enter things like the field name, the associated content types, the field types such as a text field or a number field or a field where we're applying our managed terms. We make some decisions around where we're applying the metadata fields, and then we list the associated term sets if we're managing the fields, and we begin to make some grouping decisions to make our lists of fields more manageable. And what you see here is a simplified version of what we actually use with our clients. Now let's discuss how we actually deploy our information architecture into SharePoint. Now we'll begin with our site collection and site plan. So our site structure is deployed by the creation of the various individual site collections and sites. Now those individual sites should be iterations of site templates so that we ensure consistency. For deploying our content type plan, our enterprise content types should be created through the content type hub. And we can choose to utilize multiple hubs if we'd like to. Generally, this is for the purposes of alternate syndication, so to maybe more secure site collections and sites. For deploying our metadata plan, our enterprise metadata fields should be deployed using the managed metadata service. For our term sets and our terms, we should deploy those using the term store, which is a piece of that managed metadata service. We have planned our information architecture. We have deployed our information architecture. And what remains is what is most often forgotten and what ends up destroying all of this hard work from the inside if it's ignored: sustaining our information architecture. Now, to sustain our information architecture, we have to prepare for change. And what we're creating is much more akin to a blackboard than a stone tablet. We should leverage tagging information, search data, and user feedback to modify and improve our information architecture over time. We should establish ongoing ownership of the SharePoint information architecture, and we should establish a schedule for the ongoing information architecture review. So that's our piece on information architecture in SharePoint, but that's not everything here today. If we're to understand and affect change in our SharePoint environments to enable serendipitous collaboration, as I said at the outset, it will take work. And that work flows from the enterprise level of the organization, with strategy at the top, to the tactical at the bottom. So let's resolve to understand how everything flows in an organization. What we want to achieve is serendipitous collaboration. But as I said at the outset, it's a lot of work. There are a lot of additional benefits to be attained along the way, however. So the goal is serendipitous collaboration in SharePoint, which flows from our SharePoint information architecture, which we just discussed in depth. Our SharePoint information architecture, though, doesn't just exist out of thin air. It's informed by our SharePoint governance plan, which we're about to do a deep dive on. That, too, the SharePoint governance plan, doesn't come out of thin air either. It flows from the enterprise in an enterprise information governance plan. At Optismo, we help large and mid-sized companies achieve all of the above. So let's talk SharePoint governance. And for our SharePoint governance deep dive, we're going to be leveraging the Optismo model of SharePoint governance, which divides SharePoint governance into 6 more easily digestible sections for SharePoint folks, and ensures that all areas of governance are addressed in SharePoint. So what is it that we're going to cover in this deep dive into SharePoint governance? We'll start by covering our foundational activities. Now, these foundational activities, they aren't specific parts of SharePoint governance, but they are activities that have to be completed to be able to address the governance areas that you see below. Usually these foundational activities are driven from the Enterprise Information Governance Plan. Now we'll begin with an information gathering, pulling together varied strands of policy and procedure from across an organization. We'll then develop some foundational information which we can build SharePoint governance from. The foundational information sets the tone of how your SharePoint governance plan will be formed. Guiding strategy comes next, and it is looking at SharePoint in the context of all of the other systems in the organization, because let's be serious, most organizations don't just have SharePoint. Looking at SharePoint from the perspective of where technology is moving in the organization, looking at SharePoint from a gap analysis perspective on what functions are needed by the organization that aren't yet leveraged in SharePoint, or may be needed from a third-party vendor, like one of the sponsors of Collab365. And then looking at SharePoint from the perspective of how the governance project will be guided. We'll finally look at planning our implementation of SharePoint, or if we've already implemented, cleaning up our implementation. After we've covered our foundational activities, we can then move on to the 6 areas of SharePoint governance in the Optismo model. We will look at governing the content that's added to SharePoint, governing the design and structure, not just from a branding perspective, but also from an information architecture and consistency perspective, as we've already discussed. We'll look at how development and extension of SharePoint should be governed. We should look at the people and the roles for SharePoint, moving on to security and its ever-growing shadow on all the work that we do. Finally, we'll discuss classification of information inside of SharePoint. Now let's ask the obvious question. What is SharePoint governance? Now if we ask 10 SharePoint experts, we're going to get about 20 different answers. And I think that most of the definitions that the community has bandied about so far in the SharePoint circles is pretty wildly off base. Now, why do I say that? Firstly, SharePoint governance is expansive. We've already talked about there being 6 areas converging to form SharePoint governance. SharePoint governance is big. It needs a lot of elbow room. SharePoint governance reaches all of the parts of an organization that SharePoint touches, from the typical worker who's uploading Word documents to the super IT geek who speaks to coworkers exclusively in .NET SharePoint code. And SharePoint has a lot of touch points throughout an organization. Further on that point, SharePoint is approached very, very, very differently by the many stakeholders. For some, SharePoint is a place where their content is kept or stored. For others, it's a development platform. For others, it's a workflow engine. For others, it's a business intelligence platform or a project management platform or a fill in the blank. SharePoint can be so many different things that it's approached in wildly different ways. Now, why do I think that the SharePoint community in particular has struggled with this term? Well, for my 2 cents, it's because most of the SharePoint legacy experts come from the development side. They have a development background. And when they are tossing around the term SharePoint governance, what they really mean is IT governance or development governance in SharePoint, which, although it is true, useful, and valid, it is only a small fraction of what SharePoint governance really and truly is. Okay. Let me hop back off my soapbox here. Let's talk about how we start off with the real SharePoint governance, the whole expansive thing, and we start off on the right foot. We start off right through our foundational activities, which are 1. Information gathering, 2. Foundational information, 3. Guiding strategy, and 4. Implementation planning. We're going to dive into these right now. Let's begin with information gathering. In information gathering, we want to be able to gather data and identify trends about how SharePoint should be used in the organization. This begins with developing some representative user profiles so that we don't need to ask these same questions of every single employee in our company. We align our questions to our gap analysis mapping, which we're going to discuss in a moment, and then we gather the information through one-on-one interviewing, surveys, workshops, however you believe it's going to be the most successful in your organization, and it usually depends on the corporate culture. Once we've gathered information, we can move on to establishing our foundational information. Now, our foundational information is going to help us establish the role of SharePoint in our organization. It's going to help us establish the role of systems that are cooperating with SharePoint. It's going to help us assess the maturity of our organization in some key areas and identifies any external factors which could affect our SharePoint governance project. So in establishing the role of SharePoint, it's really important to determine how SharePoint will function within the company. And we discuss this, how SharePoint can be many things to many people. Here's where we determine what SharePoint is going to be for us, for our company. And there may be multiple answers to that question, but we need to know. We'll then establish the role of the cooperating systems. What other systems are going to connect with SharePoint? Where will the data connections be? What will we be connecting? Is it going to be through the database, through the data stores? How about the user interface connections? Are we going to load some other system through an iframe inside of SharePoint, or connect the UI through search, or maybe load SharePoint functionality through the user interface of some other system? Then we need to determine what the process connections are. Maybe an HR system feeds into Active Directory and then creates a SharePoint user account. Maybe when a record is created in SharePoint, that record is automatically sent to a different records management platform. What are the process connections that you want in your organization? You'll then perform a maturity assessment. When we do maturity assessments with our clients, we break it up into 3 categories, and here's some examples to get you started. Everyone seems to do maturity assessments in their own unique way, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Then finally, you'll want to identify your external factors, anything that could derail or delay your SharePoint governance work, like a lack of budget, or some crazy policy that's out there, or a compliance angle that needs to be followed. Maybe there's some merger or acquisition or divestiture activity that means you should put your project on hold to be more effective later on. Or maybe there's other projects like systems replacements that are happening that you should be aware of. There are loads of external factors. The point here is to go seek them out and ask the right questions. Once you've done all of these foundational activities, you can then pull together all of your work into a single document. And that document we're going to call the Foundational Overview document. And you're going to reference that document throughout the rest of your SharePoint governance work because it has all of the important information you'll need within it. Establishing foundational information tends to take some time, but when it's complete, you can move on to guiding strategy. Now, I'm not going to go into depth on each of these steps, but for guiding strategy, you'll want to develop some guiding principles for your project. You'll develop a reference architecture of all technologies and how their functionality interacts and even overlaps. You'll perform a gap analysis if you haven't done so already, and then develop a technology roadmap to determine the overall direction of technology in your organization. And I just summed up a whole heck of a lot. We'll then move on to our final step in our foundational activities, implementation planning. For implementation planning, you'll document your requirements, and there are at least 100 different ways of doing this. So either follow your company's specific guidance in this, or leverage an existing standard. Then you'll develop a business case, you'll gain approval, and for this there are again 1,000 different valid ways. So again, either follow your company's specific guidance in this or leverage an existing standard. Now, we've completed our foundational activities, so congratulations. Now it's time to actually dive into some SharePoint governance. And again, at Optismo, we break this down into 6 easily digestible areas. Let's begin with content. I'm going to outline all the aspects here that you should look at. First, you want to work with your records managers, information managers, and/or your legal department to develop and implement retention policies across your information. To me, it makes a lot of sense in most organizations to simply apply records management principles to all information in SharePoint, since lawsuits don't request from companies all of their relevant records, but instead request all of their relevant information. And if you didn't understand what I just said, your records manager and legal team most definitely will, and don't misconstrue that as some sort of legal advice. You'll then establish your content type structure and rules, which we discussed a little bit in our discussion on information architecture. Again, from our information architecture discussion, we'll standardize our metadata or our columns, for those of us that are still speaking in Microsoft Ease. We'll then establish some library and list standards, and finally, we'll determine whether or not the built-in site provisioning process in 2013 fits our enterprise needs, or if we're running an earlier vision, we're going to have to build our own site provisioning process. Moving on now to design and user experience. We will establish our site organization, which I believe we know how to do in depth from our information architecture discussion. We'll be establishing our branding guidelines, which generally come directly from our marketing departments, and then our nuance to be SharePoint specific. We'll then not ignore the power of site templates, and we will create our own site templates to automatically carry some common permissions and functionality with every new site that's created. We'll establish navigation rules like what menu will go on the top of SharePoint. Should it be the same everywhere? And does it change from division to division? Then we'll wrap this up by developing some search configuration rules, which, goodness, could be a presentation all by itself here, and I believe someone does have a presentation on it later today. Now, let's discuss development governance. And let me make a disclaimer here. I'm not a .NET developer. I used to be a PHP developer, so I can give you some of the broad strokes in this area, but you'll want to tailor this. First, you want to establish your SharePoint environment rules. Generally, there are 3 environments: development, testing, and production. Then you will establish your code deployment process or processes. You may have different processes for internally coded solutions, purchase third-party solutions, and may even have a process for simple configuration changes, flipping switches and checking off checkboxes. You likely should have one for configuration changes as well. Lastly, you'll establish or at least list out your server topology if you aren't already in the cloud. You'll establish or list your applications and application pools, align where they're utilized within your site hierarchy, and then establish or list your storage architecture. Now let's discuss the next section of the Optismo SharePoint governance model: people and roles. So for people and roles, you'll establish or list out your permission groups. And we like to have our clients list out where within their hierarchy of permission groups there may be extension as well, much like we did with content types. Instead of creating brand new permissions groups, or heaven forbid you do this, utilizing custom permissions on an individual user, which, by the way, don't do that. Then you'll establish your support channels and roles. Now, it's my suggestion that you leverage your site templates or your permissions groups to establish some tiered levels of support, where the tier provides the initial level of support that's available based on either the criticality of the site or the project or the individual based on their permissions group. You'll want to establish or list out the groups that you're providing support for, the modes of support, and not to be forgotten are the support metrics. Everyone always forgets metrics. You'll then establish some training requirements by user group or permissions group. Sometimes there's overlap in those two things. Now, everyone should have some type of training available to them, whether it's on demand or formal. Now, Optismo, we provide a whole lot of end-user training and strategic SharePoint business training for our clients. You could get that from us or many of the other providers that are out there. Finally, you'll establish the roles in SharePoint's ongoing maintenance, answering the questions of who's in charge of things like search configuration updates, site provisioning, support, user onboarding, and user offboarding. Everyone always forgets the user offboarding, getting rid of users, figuring out who to assign their content to when someone leaves the organization. Things like records management, archival, etc., etc. There are lots of things that people should be in charge of, and you should list those things out. The next section of the Optismo SharePoint governance model is security. Now, for permissions, you're defining who has access to what. As I said earlier, I'm a visual person. So for me, I take my site structure chart that I've already created, and I start to simply draw some circles as I move through the org chart. As I'm making circles, I'm creating along the way some idea of common permissions. I ask myself questions like, does a person in Department A have access to Department B? And I work my way through. We also talked about role-based collaboration earlier, so I then mix in that third dimension to permissions and start to think about the various common roles across divisions and continue to make circles. It's a bit time-consuming, but it really is the most effective way that I've found of creating consistent and usable permissions groups. I go through the site structure chart and I do the same thing again. I then take my chart and simply start adding those permissions into a permissions Excel sheet. It's a template that we utilize at Optismo. For administrators, there too should be a specific hierarchy. Utilize inheritance to establish admin roles and permissions. Microsoft actually has a really useful administrators and owners worksheet for SharePoint 2010 that actually forms the basis of what we're using at Optismo. Feel free to utilize that. Finally, you'll set up rules around the creation and modification of user permissions so that you, unlike most organizations, have a good handle on your user groups. We're now at the sixth and final section of the Optismo SharePoint governance model, classification. For classification, you'll establish any forced consistent classification that you have. What I mean by this is to establish, if you must, any classification or naming standards. These rules may come from your records managers or from a specific regulation. Organizations that are in highly regulated sectors are often the ones that have these rules. If you aren't required to have a specific classification scheme or naming standard, thank your lucky stars, simply move on. We talked about content type grouping in some depth when we were discussing information architecture, but most of the time I utilize content type grouping to ensure compliance with retention and disposition standards. If you're talking to your records manager about content type groups, you can refer to them as big buckets if you want them to be on the same page as you. Big buckets. For the managed metadata service, you want to have processes and usage restrictions for adding or changing enterprise content types. Otherwise, you're going to lose your consistency and lose the findability of information, which is definitely the opposite of what you want. You'll want to also define the process and usage restrictions for extending enterprise content types, something that we discussed in our information architecture section. Are you seeing how everything is related to that? It may also be helpful to list out some example scenarios for which adds or edits could be made. Also, as a side note, forms and workflow are always helpful for approval type processes. You'll now want to establish how the content organizer can be used. Things like records management, workflow, fulfillment, publishing processes, and the like are all fair game. Also, feel free to utilize content organizer functionality in conjunction with forms or workflow if you're really feeling like a SharePoint champ here. That's it for SharePoint governance. As a recap, we talked through the foundational activities of information gathering, foundational information, guiding strategy, and implementation planning. Then we used the Optismo SharePoint governance model and discussed the 6 SharePoint governance areas of content, design and structure, development, people and roles, security, and classification. As I mentioned before, this SharePoint governance planning shouldn't come out of nowhere. It should come from an enterprise information governance plan. I developed at Optismo the information governance model, and we made this an open source model that can be downloaded at infogovmodel.com. If you're in an enterprise-wide strategic information role in your company, this is the perfect tool for you. So download this at infogovmodel.com or contact me and I'll give you some more resources if you're in a strategic information role in your company. Now, if we can go back to the beginning of our discussion, all of this work in structuring information is needed to enable collaboration. And the best part of collaboration when it happens accidentally. It takes work. So don't be like this. Plan and do the work. You now have all the resources to do it yourself, or shoot me an email or call me. My team can help. Finally, get your results and utilize metrics to track the results. And email me to say, "Thank you for drastically improving my company, Nick. I owe it all to you." No, I'm obviously joking. I want to thank you for sitting through this presentation. I know I threw a lot of information at you in this session. And that's it, folks. I want to thank, again, the Collab365 team for putting on this event and the sponsors for funding it. Very selfishly, I ask that you visit optismo.com and igkit.com to see how we can help your company achieve information governance success inside or outside of the SharePoint platform and Microsoft ecosystem. Enjoy the rest of the Collab365 conference, folks.